Okay, so I'm going to start off with a quick apology for last week. I ended up with a crazy schedule that just did not work out well. I had a meeting that was scheduled last minute. So we will talk about overwintering pollinators the first week of November. So I'll just kind of circle back to that topic because it is an important topic, as we've learned a lot about where pollinators spend their winters and some of our practices that are detrimental to them. So we'll talk about that. But today we're going to talk about silvopasture. And just a quick, I think everyone on today is familiar, but Women Owning Woodland is our program that's being developed to provide learning opportunities to women landowners. We organize field days, lunch and learns, and classes that are geared towards women forest landowners and enthusiasts. Facebook page that we try to put some, networking opportunities and places to connect. I try to also share all of, even my non-WOW programs, I try to share there so everyone can see what's going on. And then today I have a quick, just kind of upcoming events. If you're kind of in the central Missouri area, so Danville, I forget which county it's in. I probably have it open on my desktop, but Angela George, she's with the Missouri Department of Conservation. She's a forester. She is going to be leading a women's hike at Danville Conservation Area this coming Saturday. If you go to the MDC page and search for it, you can find the registration link for that. They are asking people to register. And I think last I looked, she's limiting to 50 people, but there were still 41 spaces available. Hopefully it should be, I'm down here kind of in South Central Missouri, and our leaves are just kind of starting to change. So it should be a beautiful hike because I imagine they're a little bit ahead of us on foliage. Other things that are coming up, October 26th, 27th, and 28th in the evening, Gatlin Bunton, who's an agronomist, and myself, and then Carly Dawson, who was on not last week, but the week before, talking about deer management. We are putting on a food plot for wildlife webinar, and that one does have a fee of $25 for it. A registration is on the extension website. And then if you are up for travel or in the area, November 5th, I'll be offering a chainsaw safety class at Wordak Research Farm, which is in Cook Station. So it's very southern Crawford County, if you're not familiar. And that one, it's open to anybody, so it's not Women Owning Woodlands only. And it'll be myself and then Dr. Hank Stelter and Dr. Dusty Wordak, who's the superintendent. The three of us kind of teach this class as a joint effort. But morning will be classroom stuff, talking about selection of a saw, looking at different sizes, talking about the parts, maintenance, all of the kind of classroom stuff in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we're going to go out and do some demonstrations, and all the participants should get a chance to cut down a tree on their own. So that's pretty exciting. Again, this one it costs $50, but please, if you're interested, contact me because we do have some scholarships available for that. And then if you want to stay in the area and hang out for a second day, on November 6th, which is a Saturday, we'll be doing a walk in the woods at Wordak Research Farm. And this is free and includes lunch. It'll be 10 to 2:30 or 9 to 2:30 is what we have scheduled for Walk in the Woods. And we will be taking kind of a tour of the Wordak woods that we have down there. We have a session for some tree ID, talking about the White Oak Initiative and regeneration. We have a timber sale that is active right now, so we'll go visit that and talk about timber management practices. And then Extension has brought on, they've not all joined us, but we have 4 positions for what we call feral hog educators, and they are going to work with landowners to kind of talk to them about how to recognize feral hog damage and how to get rid of them and control them, and also how to go back and kind of reclaim land after they've had feral hogs as far as restoration. And so one of, I don't remember which educator will be there, but one of them will also be at these Walk in the Woods and talk a little bit about their new positions. So they just started the beginning of October. And we'll do a shiitake log demonstration. And I think that's all of it that we have on the schedule. So it'll be a pretty full day along with a lunch. So, and that has registration as well on the extension website. So yeah, fall always gets pretty busy. It seems like lots to talk about, and being out in the woods is a lot more fun. So we plan more things. Okay, today I'm going to talk about silvopasture, and silvopasture is one of like the 5 agroforestry practices. So there's 5 recognized practices, and those are like windrows, silvopasture, riparian buffers, and I won't be able to remember the rest of these as I go through them. Windrows, silvopasture, riparian buffers. There's 2 more, and they'll come to me before the end, and I'll share those with you. But silvopasture is a big one, and there's been a lot of talk of this one in Missouri. We actually have the Agroforestry Center at the University of Missouri, so it's a pretty big deal. We also have a silvopasture expert that's come on board. Her name's Dr. Ashley Conway. She's working on some research actually at WordAC at the research farm to do some silvopasture demonstrations for landowners who are interested. I will say that silvopasture has kind of mixed feelings in the forestry world. So historically, as foresters, we've been taught to keep livestock out of the woods because they can be detrimental to trees and root systems and soil health. And so in some cases, it seems kind of counterintuitive to say we're going to, try and manage for silvopasture so that we can have trees and livestock together. But traditionally and historically, we used to have bison and some other hoofed animals, that were thicker and populations were larger in our woods. So perhaps there's kind of a balance where we can find, and that's kind of what silvopasture is trying to find, that balance in between livestock management and good, healthy forests. So we don't want to sacrifice one to have the other. So today we're going to talk about what silvopasture is. We're going to talk about the management system components, and then we're going to describe the benefits. And so currently I'll say that there is some cost share for silvopasture. Unfortunately, a lot of landowners I talk that are giving consideration to silvopasture, they have wood and they would like to thin it down to allow livestock in there. Unfortunately, the only cost share that we have for silvopasture is kind of the opposite. If you have pasture, they will provide you cost share to plant trees to install or make that into a silvopastoral system. So again, just kind of one of the drawbacks. And then we'll talk a little bit about the benefits of silvopasture. So again, agroforestry are intentional combining of agriculture and working trees to create sustainable farming systems. And see, I told you I would come to me later. Riparian buffers, alley cropping, forest farming, windbreaks, and silvopasture. Those are our 5 recognized agroforestry systems that we utilize. And like I said, today we're going to talk about silvopasture, but all of these systems utilize trees in some way to create these more sustainable farming systems. And if we think about agroforestry, what a great idea for us to kind of combine those benefits, especially as we look at things as far as carbon storage and carbon sequestration. We know that trees are really good for this. So if we can integrate that into some of our larger farming systems, we can, again, store more carbon and have hopefully healthier farming systems and healthier ecosystems. That's really, the goal. And there's a lot of agroforestry that's used in other countries as well as in the US. So it's, again, becoming more popular. I took actually an agroforestry class this past spring, and there's a lot of benefits that were talked about as far as, long-term agricultural benefits as well as forest health and ecosystem. So being able to grow food, but again, maintain some of that ecosystem is very important. So on to silvopasture. So silvopasture is the combination of timber, livestock, and forage production on the same acreage. So our trees provide long-term returns. So these are going to be kind of a long-term investment. We all know it takes trees quite a while to grow to a size where they can be harvested. So they do provide some short-term benefits as far as shade for livestock. In fact, a little bit of shading for grasses that grow underneath them. But there are a long-term return, and then the livestock and the forages that we generate underneath that, those are going to provide an annual income. And this is, kind of a good solution as far as it's hard to think about the return on investment, particularly with timber. And in Missouri, it takes us, we don't have a lot of pine systems in Missouri, so you can go into pine systems down south and they can be harvested pretty much every 25 to 40 years. Whereas our hardwoods that we generally have up here in Missouri, and that's what our markets are geared for, it's going to be, 60, 80, 100 years for us to generate income from selling trees if we started from scratch. So most of the time our forests are established and we're going to work with timber sales from that direction. But it does take us, we do have a long-term investment. So research has documented that a lot of cool and warm season grasses and legumes will actually yield high levels of really quality forage if they're grown under a canopy. And traditionally, a lot of silvopasture is done under pine canopy, but it can be done under hardwood canopy. Like I said, that some of our research at WordAct will be looking at silvopasture systems under kind of an oak hickory forest, which will be really interesting. It does take this process, this management practice, takes advantage of our differences in trees and grasses. So trees and grasses are going to capture light and utilize soil resources differently. So the trees in a silvopasture system, they are planted less densely than we would in a typical forest management plan. And this is so we can get more sunlight to that forage that's underneath. And we can do silvopasture systems, like again, in Missouri, our cost share goes one way. So it is if we take an existing pasture and we plant trees into it. But without cost share, you're still capable of thinning and pruning a forest and putting forage underneath. So in fact, that's one of our projects that we're working on at WordAct is taking existing forests and thinning it back so that we are picking crop trees and opening up the canopy so that forages, and it'll probably be native warm season grasses that are planted underneath that for forage. So it will be a completely native plant system. So that also is really exciting. Again, what silvopasture isn't, it's not woodland grazing. So it's not fencing in woods and turning the cattle in there to graze on whatever they can find. It's also not forest grazing, and it's not range grazing. So it is a very deliberate combination of trees and forage that is very managed. And most of the time with our silvopasture systems, we aren't turning the cows or whatever livestock it is into the forest indefinitely and letting them graze forever. These are usually done kind of in quick rotational grazing systems where they spend just a little bit of time in there and then they'll move on to the next paddock. And this helps preserve tree roots and soil integrity because we're not letting them kind of trample the same soil over and over and over again with this type of system. So again, the main components of this are trees, forages, and then livestock. I show cattle here because in Missouri, this is probably our most common livestock that we think of as far as grazers. You guys probably all know there's been some research done with goats and forest invasives, but we don't have a lot of information as far as grazing them in these silvopasture systems, but not to say that they couldn't be used for this. Types of trees. So again, historically, there's been a lot of research with silvopasture and pine. It seems, again, the rotation is shorter than our typical hardwoods for pines. They also have kind of that really nice straight stem that you see. So it makes them kind of a good component to let sunlight hit the forest floor, the forage that's below. But there's definitely some work that's going into looking at hardwoods, which again, Missouri, we're pretty much typically a hardwood state, except for down south where we do have shortleaf pine. And it certainly would be in the realm of possibility to put a silvopasture system in with shortleaf pine in southern Missouri. Just not something that's done a lot because we don't have a big, it's hard to sell pine in Missouri. We don't have great shortleaf pine markets. So a lot of the research in Missouri is done with hardwoods. And one of our more common research practices for silvopasture that we've looked at is growing walnuts with silvopasture systems underneath. So the walnut are typically established and they're going to be protected from protected from livestock in the beginning. So they get fenced off. So cows or whatever other livestock, sheep, goats, they don't nip down the seedlings when they're established. And then those developing tree root systems are going to be protected as well by a fence system. And then once they're large enough, they will take those fences off and kind of open it up. But you can see here in this kind of middle picture, a very typical silvopasture black walnut system that we have going. And this is, again, one of our more researched ones in Missouri. We'll also do this with pecan trees in certain parts. And then just sometimes kind of our typical other hardwoods that we have that are of value. So you could do a silvopasture system with white oak, for example. So again, our silvopasture systems with hardwood species is not as well researched as conifer species, but hopefully we'll have lots more research as Dr. Conway kind of works through some of that research at WordAC. Forages that we put underneath, so you can use cool season grasses or warm season grasses underneath. Again, the cool season is going to be typically fescue, which is pretty much what's most commonly grown probably in most of our pastures across Missouri. And then legumes, so a kind of combination of different clovers or some of the lespedizas, they can be seeded underneath this type of system. And then warm season. And warm season, to me, has more interest because I do really like the idea of working with native species in this type of grazing system. Again, you can definitely use fescue or kind of other seeded legumes, but I really like the idea of working with native grasses to kind of have just kind of this more natural ecosystem in place. So this includes things like switchgrass or big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass. Those can be used as high quality forage, but also kind of maintain that native component. Livestock that we put into silvopasture systems, again, cattle are kind of our most typical in Missouri, but in like the Southeast US, they've included things like bison. They've also done research with goats and sheep and horses. Also, some work has been done with poultry. So they've actually used domestic geese in some fruit tree orchards. So as long as there's not fruit on the trees or like blackberry patches, they've used geese to kind of maintain the grass. Up at the Horticulture and Agroforestry Research Center at Hark, they actually have done some work with they have a kind of a research vineyard up there, and they have put the sheep in the vineyard to mow the grass, and that has worked really well. There are also some other potential livestock choices that aren't traditional. So things like game animals, deer, elk, and caribou. So if someone's doing kind of a wild game farm, they might be able to combine that as well with some silvopasture systems. Benefits of silvopasture. So going from pasture to silvopasture or from forest to silvopasture system, our outcome is pretty similar. So benefits include improved plant vigor, lower animal stress. So we've all probably driven by an open pasture in August and felt really bad for the Black Angus cattle that were hanging out there in the sun. So they have shade in these types of systems, which lowers their stress levels, and does also help with weight gain in the long term. Reduced wildfire risk. So in this type of system with your livestock grazing in this grass understory, it typically stays green throughout much of the year, and it stays, again, they graze on pretty much everything underneath there. So this reduces wildfire risk. It also improves wildlife habitat. So when we don't have livestock in there, this kind of acts as a natural forest system, and it improves general wildlife habitat. It also is a good way for landowners to have forests, but also get an annual income off of selling livestock, or perhaps haying underneath their trees. And then we do have our long-term income with those trees for later. Again, with that improved plant vigor, we usually see a lot of faster tree growth, because if you look at these silvopasture systems, it's not as many trees per acre. So they are benefiting from increased sunlight on their canopy and increased nutrient uptake. The trees generally, and you could probably argue this one way or the other, but in some of the research, it's shown that they actually are a little bit healthier overall because of this. It also increases kind of our nutrient cycling. And so again, there's kind of some benefit, especially if folks fertilize the forage underneath, which is pretty typical. In addition, we have a lot of nutrient cycling that comes from waste from our livestock as it goes through, which again increases the amount of nutrients for those trees to grow from. Higher forage quality. So there's definitely been research that shows moderate shade is actually best for forage production with a lot of our species of grasses. So they do better without like that complete full sun, extra high temperatures. That shade actually keeps a little bit cooler and keeps them in those more ideal growing temperatures, which increases our forage production. And then a lengthened forage growing season. So again, cool season grasses, if we're talking about them, they tend to turn off once it gets above 80 degrees, then they kind of quit growing. But if we have them in kind of these partially shaded environments, they're going to have that increased growing season. So we're going to be producing grass longer. So lower animal stress. So this is, again, trees provide evaporative cooling. They reduce our radiant heat loss at night, so they hold warmer temperatures, so doesn't get as cool in the evening. And they also reduce the wind speeds. If you think about, we talk about agroforestry practice of wind buffers. So all of these things increase our livestock performance. And I'll tell you that I'm not a livestock specialist by any stretch of the imagination, but it does provide, research has shown that these animals actually put on weight faster and are just overall healthier because they're not in super hot conditions. They're also protected during the winter. Those trees, again, they're going to kind of hold in some of that radiant heat. Some of the things, again, I'm not a livestock person, but some of our research has shown that increased weight gain, increased milk yield, and increased conception rates for cattle and sheep that are put in pastures with trees, particularly in warm environments. And again, kind of lower veterinary bills, again, just kind of goes back to just overall generally healthier livestock. Reduced wildfire risk. Again, Missouri, we just have pretty low wildfire risk, but we do tend to see them in the spring and in the fall. But because we've reduced stand density, we reduced the fuel loads, and trees buffer from the wind, all of these things kind of help with our overall fire risk in these types of systems. Again, Missouri, we're not a big we don't see a lot of wildfire. We do see some in the spring and fall, like I said, but usually they stay moderately small, and we don't see the great big fires like we see out west, or sometimes in the southeast. They can have some pretty severe wildfires as well. So this has that benefit in those areas. Improvement for wildlife habitat. So silvopasture systems can provide, again, this is kind of the big compromise where we can have some of our typical livestock production or agricultural production, but also maintain the benefits of forest life. So again, wildlife habitat needs created by silvopasture include adequate year-round food supplies. So whether you're in an area that is pine driven or hardwood driven, it's going to be providing those foods from those trees. In addition, some of these grasses and legumes that we use in our forage systems provide very beneficial food supplies for some of our wildlife. So in particular, quail and turkey have been shown to really benefit from this kind of mixture of warm season grasses and silvopasture with trees, especially in some of our hardwood research. Again, very prematurely, but white oaks utilized in the silvopasture system, they're going to provide a lot of acorns, and they're going to additionally have then those ground resources with legumes and warm season grasses. So all of that serves as good wildlife habitat and food supplies. We also maintain the cover. So an open pasture may not be as appealing to a turkey or quail, but by providing some of that cover with trees and roosting areas, that's going to provide, extra cover for them and suitable cover. And then well-distributed water. So these systems tend to have kind of water occurring throughout, so our growth is pretty consistent. And then we also usually have some type of water source out for our livestock that can also be utilized by wildlife. And then, of course, the benefit to landowners is that annual and long-term income. So this, is a very maintainable long-term system, and it provides a lot of long-term productivity. In general, our economic risk is reduced because we're going to be able to produce multiple products like meat, milk, hay, saw timber, veneer logs, post poles, pulpwood, firewood, organic mulches, harvested game, nuts, fruit, ornamental flowers, greenery, mushrooms, and a lot of other products using these types of systems. And our production costs are reduced because of that distribution of different products. So again, it's not for everybody, but it does provide some more sustainable solutions, particularly to our agricultural needs. And so again, not trying to make a sales pitch for this or anything, but it is, again, a good way for us to meet agriculture needs, but also maintain habitats and our overall tree systems. And I think we'll see this more important as we kind of move into this era of carbon sequestration and thinking about where we're storing carbon. Trees have become, more important. We see it every day in the news talking about these ideas of trees and carbon sequestration. So I think, but the demand for agricultural products is not reducing. So how do we meet both needs? This is kind of one of those potential compromise solutions. If you're curious about learning more, there's so the USDA Forest Service, they have a National Agroforestry Center that's got a lot of resources. The University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry has a lot of resources. They also, it is typically held in, I believe, like the first week of August, but they actually have an agroforestry academy. So it's a full week of agroforestry learning. So you go and spend the week up in the Horticulture and Agroforestry Research Center is in I won't, up near Columbia. I can't think of the name of the town that they're in. But you'll stay up in that area for the whole week, and they'll take you on all sorts of tours, and you'll get to see the Agroforestry Center and some of the research they have going and how it works. So very interesting. And then there's the Association for Temperate Agroforestry. So this is kind of more of a larger scale, but it's very interesting because it's very applicable to our part of the world. And then NRCS also has some information. If you go, this is their general website, but if you go to their kind of generic website and put in agroforestry, it'll bring up kind of things that they have in place, particularly cost share that supports agroforestry practices. So again, still kind of an up and coming part of research. There's also, and I should have put their information on here, there's another organization called the Savannah Institute, and they provide a lot of webinars and internship opportunities and tours of agroforestry practices in place. Lots of interesting information from them as well. Okay, I will quit sharing and take questions if anyone has any questions for me today. No questions today. So you can see my background today. So this is the time of year I made this one my background on purpose. So if you're not total subject change, but if you're looking for invasive species, this is what our honeysuckles start to look like this time of year. So if you're trying to target them. All right, well, no questions today. Next week, we're going to talk about pond management, and we're going to talk about things that you can do to keep ponds healthy, but also things you can do in the terrestrial components that will also help keep ponds healthy. So, you know, how and when you can spray herbicides and pesticides close to water, what types of herbicides and pesticides are good for that, and then some overall kind of pond maintenance as far as maintaining like aquatic vegetation and fish populations. We'll talk about all of that next week. And then the week after that, Haley Lockard, who is with Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, she is going to come and talk about quail habitat. So she'll talk about some practices that improve quail habitat. And that will wrap up October, which is hard to think about that we're so close to the end of the year. All right, well, have a great rest of the day. Thank you for being here today. See you next week.